December 1944. A black Italian prisoner stands in an American mess hall, staring at a plate piled with more food than she's seen in a year. Across the room, a white lieutenant watches her with an intensity that breaks every regulation. Their eyes meet. Everything they've been taught says this is impossible. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from and don't forget to click subscribe. October 7th, 1944. The transport ship cut through the grey Atlantic waters like a blade through silk, carrying cargo that would challenge everything Lieutenant Marco De Vincenzo thought he knew about warfare. Inside the converted hold, 28 Italian women sat on wooden benches, former auxiliary members of Mussolini's forces captured during the Allied advance through Sicily. They were exhausted, frightened, and completely unprepared for what awaited them in America. But it was one prisoner in particular who would change everything, not just for Marco, but for everyone who witnessed what happened next. Gabriella Russo sat near the back of the hold, her dark skin glistening with the sheen of seasickness and fear. At 23, she was one of only 3 black Italian women in the entire group, born in Palermo to a Sicilian mother and an Eritrean father who had come to Italy during the colonial campaigns. She had served as a translator and communications specialist, her fluency in Italian, Arabic, and broken English making her invaluable to the Italian forces. Now, she clutched a small cloth bag containing everything she owned in the world, wondering if the Americans would see her as Italian, as African, or as something else entirely that didn't fit their understanding of enemies. The ship docked in New York Harbor on October 15th at dawn, the Statue of Liberty emerging from the morning mist like a promise no one had made to these women. They were processed through a warehouse facility in Brooklyn, photographed and fingerprinted with surprising efficiency. American military police, both white and Negro soldiers, moved them through the system with professional detachment. Gabriella noticed how the Negro soldiers looked at her with something she couldn't quite identify. Not hostility, but a complex mixture of recognition and confusion. She was black like them, but Italian, an enemy, yet somehow family. The contradiction seemed to live in their eyes. Lieutenant Marco De Vincenzo stood on the loading dock of Camp Kilmer in New Jersey, watching the trucks approach with their unusual cargo. At 29, he was a first-generation Italian-American from the Bronx, his parents having immigrated in 1920. He spoke fluent Italian, which was why he'd been assigned to oversee this particular prisoner of war facility. The irony wasn't lost on him that he would be guarding women who spoke his parents' language, who came from villages his relatives still lived in, who represented the country his family had fled for a better life. What he didn't expect was Gabriella. When she stepped down from the truck at 1400 hours, moving with a grace that seemed impossible given the circumstances, Marco felt something shift in his chest. She was beautiful in a way that transcended the dirt and exhaustion of travel, her dark skin luminous despite the grey October afternoon, her large brown eyes taking in everything with an intelligence that suggested she missed nothing. She wore the same auxiliary uniform as the other women, but on her it looked different, like she was playing a part rather than being defined by it. Their eyes met for exactly 3 seconds. In that brief moment, Marco saw her register surprise at his Italian features, saw her mind working to categorize him, American, but not quite, authority, but with her people's face. He saw confusion flicker across her expression, quickly masked by the careful neutrality prisoners learned to wear. Then she looked away, following the other women toward the processing building, and Marco realized he'd been holding his breath. Staff Sergeant William Hayes, a Negro soldier from Georgia who'd been assigned as Marco's second-in-command, noticed the exchange. He approached Marco with the easy confidence of a man who'd learned to read between the lines of every situation. "That's going to be interesting," he said quietly, gesturing subtly toward Gabriella. "Italian, but one of ours too. Wonder how that's going to play." Marco frowned, suddenly defensive in a way he didn't fully understand. "She's a prisoner, Hayes. That's all that matters." Hayes just smiled, the knowing smile of someone who'd seen this story before. "If you say so, Lieutenant." The women were housed in a converted barracks at the edge of the facility, separated from the main camp by chain-link fencing and guard towers. 28 women in a space designed for 50 men, giving them more room than most prisoners of war could expect. The building had been hastily prepared with canvas partitions, creating small areas for privacy, cots with actual mattresses, and a coal stove that would keep them warm through the approaching winter. Gabriella chose a cot near the window, drawn to the light even though it also meant being visible to the guards who patrolled outside. She unpacked her small bag with methodical precision, placing the photograph of her parents on the small shelf beside her bed, arranging her few possessions with the care of someone who'd learned that maintaining order in small things helped when everything large had fallen apart. The other Italian women watched her with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Gabriella was used to this. In Italy, her mixed heritage had always marked her as other, never quite Italian enough, never quite African enough, always existing in the space between categories that people preferred to keep separate. Maria Benedetti, a 31-year-old nurse from Rome, had been kind enough during the voyage, but even her kindness carried an edge of uncertainty, as if she wasn't quite sure how to treat someone who looked like the Eritrean labourers she'd seen in Italy's colonies, but spoke Italian with a Sicilian accent. The dinner bell rang at 1800 hours, a sound that would become as familiar as breathing in the months to come. The women looked at each other uncertainly, unsure of what to expect. An American soldier appeared at the door, young and nervous, clearly uncomfortable with his assignment. He gestured for them to follow, speaking in slow, careful English that none of them fully understood. They filed across the compound to a mess hall that stood separate from the main facilities. The building was warm, lit by overhead lights that seemed almost extravagant after months of rationing and blackouts in Italy. Long tables stretched across the room, and the smell that filled the space made Gabriella's stomach clench with sudden desperate hunger. Tomato sauce, garlic, meat cooking, bread baking, real food prepared with abundance rather than scarcity. But it was the man behind the serving line who made her freeze mid-step. Sergeant William Hayes stood there wearing a white apron over his uniform, his dark hands moving with practiced efficiency as he prepared to serve the evening meal. A Negro man, in a position of authority, serving food to white Italian women who had fought for a fascist regime that had colonized his ancestral homeland. The irony was so thick, Gabriella could taste it. Hayes looked up as the women filed in, his expression carefully neutral. His eyes found Gabriella immediately, recognition sparking between them. She was the only one in the group who looked like him, the only one who would understand the complexity of this moment. He nodded slightly, acknowledging something they both knew but couldn't speak aloud. Lieutenant De Vincenzo stood near the doorway, observing. He'd specifically requested Hayes for this assignment, knowing that having a Negro sergeant serve Italian prisoners would send a message about American values. But watching Hayes and Gabriella lock eyes, seeing something pass between them that transcended language and nationality, Marco felt an unexpected twist of something that might have been jealousy. Through an interpreter, Hayes explained the serving process. They would form a line, receive plates and utensils, and the kitchen staff would serve them their meals. They could sit anywhere they liked. Water and coffee were available. His words were translated by Corporal Janet Morrison, a white soldier from Iowa who'd grown up speaking Italian thanks to her immigrant grandmother. Gabriella joined the line, her heart pounding. She'd been hungry for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to anticipate eating. In the final months before capture, Italian rations had been cut to near starvation levels. Breakfast had been ersatz coffee and a crust of bread. Lunch, when it came, might be watery soup with a few vegetable scraps. She'd learned to ignore the constant ache in her belly, to stop thinking about the abundant meals of her childhood. When she reached the serving station, Hayes looked at her for a long moment before speaking in English. "What's your name?" Gabriella understood enough to respond. "Gabriella Russo." "Welcome to America, Miss Russo." His voice carried layers of meaning she couldn't quite pass. Then he began filling her plate with portions that made her eyes widen in disbelief. Spaghetti with meat sauce, the pasta piled high and steaming, 3 large meatballs, each one perfectly browned, a thick slice of white bread with butter, green beans cooked with bits of bacon. It was more food than she'd seen in a single meal in over a year. She stared at the plate, certain there had been a mistake. Hayes saw her confusion and spoke again. "It's all yours." Standard portion. Standard. The word echoed in her mind as she carried her impossibly full plate to the nearest table. Around her, the other Italian women were having similar reactions, staring at their plates with expressions ranging from disbelief to suspicion. No one touched their food. Finally, Maria Benedetti picked up her fork, twirled spaghetti, lifted it to her mouth and took a single bite. Her eyes closed. A sound escaped her throat that was somewhere between a sob and a sigh. That was all the permission the others needed. Suddenly, the mess hall filled with the sounds of eating, of women who had been starving for months, finally allowing themselves to believe this bounty was real. Gabriella took her first bite and had to stop herself from weeping. The sauce was rich with tomatoes, garlic, herbs she couldn't identify. The meatballs were tender and seasoned perfectly. The pasta itself was cooked just right. This was food prepared with skill and care. Food meant to nourish and satisfy. Halfway through her plate she had to stop. Her stomach, shrunken from months of deprivation, protested the sudden abundance. Lieutenant De Vincenzo had been watching from his position near the door. He saw Gabriella's struggle and understood it immediately. He crossed the room, aware that every eye followed his movement. When he reached her table, she looked up with those large brown eyes, and he saw wariness mixed with something else. "Non finirlo se non puoi," he said in Italian. "Don't finish it if you can't. Ci sarà più domani. There will be more tomorrow." Gabriella's eyes widened at hearing her language from this American officer's mouth. She responded carefully. "This is really for us? Every day?" Marco nodded. 3 meals a day, as much as you need. You're prisoners under the Geneva Convention. That means you will be treated with dignity. This isn't a trick. This is just how we do things. Something in Gabriella's chest cracked open. She looked down at her half-finished plate and whispered, "Why?" Marco didn't have a simple answer. "Because you're human beings. That doesn't stop being true just because we were on opposite sides of a war." The first week established patterns that would define the months to come. 3 times a day, the dinner bell rang, and 3 times a day, the Italian women filed into the mess hall to find generous portions waiting. By the 4th day, most could finish full plates. Their bodies were adjusting, remembering what it meant to be nourished. But food was only part of the transformation. The real change came in the gradual dissolution of the careful distance between prisoners and guards. It started with Sergeant Hayes. On the evening of the 3rd day, he asked through Corporal Morrison if any of the women would be willing to help in the kitchen. Gabriella volunteered immediately. She missed working with food, missed the creative act of cooking that had been such a large part of her childhood. Her father's restaurant in Palermo had been her second home. Hayes welcomed them into his kitchen the next morning with genuine enthusiasm. "First rule," he said through Morrison's translation, "in my kitchen, everybody eats while they cook. Can't create good food on an empty stomach." He started by asking what they knew how to make. Gabriella explained her background, her father's restaurant, the Sicilian dishes she'd grown up with, the Eritrean specialties that made their place unique. Hayes's eyes lit up. "Show me." Over the following days, the kitchen became a space of cultural exchange that transcended the prisoner-guard dynamic. Gabriella taught Hayes how to make pasta alla norma. In return, Hayes taught them Southern cooking, techniques from his grandmother in Georgia. He showed them fried chicken, biscuits, collard greens, sweet potato pie. But it was the conversations while cooking that truly changed things. Hayes spoke about growing up in Georgia, about being a Negro soldier fighting for a country that treated him as second class. Gabriella understood that complexity in her bones. She shared her own story. Born in Palermo to a mixed couple when Italy's colonial ambitions made such unions controversial. Growing up, never quite fitting anywhere. Lieutenant De Vincenzo found himself drawn to the kitchen more often than his duties required. He came to watch Gabriella. She transformed when she cooked. The careful neutrality she maintained fell away, replaced by focused joy. Her hands moved with confidence, chopping vegetables, stirring sauces, adjusting seasonings with instinct. Marco spoke Italian, so he caught things the others missed. The way Gabriella described her father's restaurant with affection, tinged with sadness. How her voice changed when she mentioned her mother, the pride she took in teaching others her family's recipes. On the 8th day, Gabriella was making arancini, Sicilian rice balls that had been her father's signature dish. Marco watched from the doorway, and she must have sensed his presence because she looked up suddenly, catching him staring. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Gabriella did something unexpected. She plated one of the freshly fried arancini and carried it over to him. "Assaggialo," she said in Italian. "Taste it." Marco took the plate. The arancino was still hot, steaming. He took a bite and understood why her father's restaurant had been successful. The rice was perfectly cooked, seasoned with saffron. The meat filling was rich and savory. "È perfetto," he said. "It's perfect." Gabriella's face transformed with a smile that hit Marco like a physical impact. It was the first time he'd seen her really smile. The smile reached her eyes, making them sparkle. "Mio padre mi ha insegnato," lei disse. "My father taught me." The moment stretched between them, something shifting. Hayes cleared his throat pointedly. Marco stepped back, remembering his position, remembering she was a prisoner, and he was her guard. But as he left, he could still taste the arancino, could still see Gabriella's smile burning in his memory. The women were assigned work details beyond kitchen duty. Gabriella found herself working in the camp library, organizing books under the supervision of Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, Sergeant Hayes's mother who'd taken a job on base. Mrs. Hayes was a Negro woman in her late 50s, with silver threading through her dark hair. She carried herself with quiet dignity and treated Gabriella with respect that transcended their roles. "You read English?" Mrs. Hayes asked on Gabriella's first day. "Little bit," Gabriella admitted. "I learn more." Mrs. Hayes nodded approvingly. "Then we'll practice while you work." The library became Gabriella's sanctuary. Mrs. Hayes taught her English with patient persistence. But more than language lessons, she provided mentorship. Understanding, a reflection of her own complicated identity. One afternoon, Mrs. Hayes said something that changed everything. "You remind me of myself at your age, caught between worlds, not quite fitting anywhere." Gabriella looked up. "How?" Mrs. Hayes settled into a chair. "I'm light-skinned. My grandmother was white. In the South, that makes you not quite Negro enough for some folks, not white enough for others, always explaining yourself." The recognition in Gabriella's chest was so strong, it hurt. "Yes, exactly yes." "But here's what I learned," Mrs. Hayes continued. "America gives you room to become something new. Not Italian or Eritrean, but Italian-American. Not white or Negro, but just yourself. It takes time, but it's possible here." The conversation stayed with Gabriella. She began to see her imprisonment differently, not as punishment, but as transition. Not as an ending, but a strange kind of beginning. Lieutenant De Vincenzo noticed the change in her. She walked with more confidence. Her English improved daily. She started participating in evening gatherings where prisoners and guards would play cards or games. She laughed more easily, and the sound did things to Marco's concentration that were entirely inappropriate. He tried to maintain professional distance, but then she would look at him across the mess hall, her dark eyes meeting his with an intelligence that saw through his composure, and all his good intentions would evaporate. Hayes noticed. Mrs. Hayes noticed. Hayes approached Marco on a cold November afternoon. "Lieutenant, we need to talk." They walked to the edge of the compound. Hayes didn't waste time. "You're falling for her," Marco started to deny it, then realized the futility. "It doesn't matter what I feel. I know the regulations." "Do you? Because you're in that kitchen every day watching her cook. You're in the library chatting in Italian. You're at every gathering she attends. You're not being subtle." Marco ran his hand through his hair. "What am I supposed to do?" "She's different from anyone I've ever met. She's intelligent and talented and kind. How am I supposed to ignore that?" Hayes was quiet. "I'm not saying ignore it. I'm saying be smart. Right now she's a prisoner and you're in authority. Anything between you exists in that context. That makes it complicated at best, coercive at worst. I would never—" "I know. But she's not free to say no to you, not really. That's the problem. Even if she felt the same way, the power dynamic makes it impossible to know if her feelings are genuine or survival instinct." The words hit Marco hard. "So what do I do?" Hayes met his eyes. "You wait. The war will end. She'll be repatriated or maybe choose to stay. Either way, there will come a time when she's no longer your prisoner. If what you feel is real, it'll survive until then." It was good advice. Advice Marco fully intended to follow. Then he entered the mess hall that evening and saw Gabriella teaching Maria how to make his mother's gnocchi recipe, and all his resolve crumbled. She looked up, her face lighting with a smile, and called out in Italian, "Vieni, help us decide if these are as good as your mama's." Marco knew he was in trouble, the kind that had nothing to do with regulations and everything to do with the heart's refusal to follow orders. November brought Thanksgiving. Captain Morrison decided to include the Italian prisoners in the celebration. For 3 days, the kitchen operated at maximum capacity. Gabriella found herself assigned to dessert preparation, making Italian pastries alongside American pies. Thanksgiving Day arrived with unseasonable warmth. The mess hall had been transformed with decorations. The meal was extraordinary. Turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, green beans, rolls, and an array of desserts. The Italian women and American soldiers sat together. Captain Morrison gave a brief speech about gratitude and treating people with dignity. Then Sergeant Hayes stood, surprising everyone. "I grew up in Georgia," he began, waiting for translation, "where folks who looked like me weren't allowed to sit at the same table as folks who looked different, where the color of your skin determined where you could eat. I joined the army thinking I was fighting for freedom." He paused. "Today I'm grateful for this strange circumstance. These women were our enemies on paper, but breaking bread with them has taught me something. War makes enemies. But food, kindness, respect, these things make family." The mess hall was silent. Then Maria Benedetti stood and began to clap. The applause spread until everyone was standing, honoring the truth of his words. The evening ended with music. Someone produced a harmonica, another a guitar. They sang songs from both sides of the Atlantic. Gabriella had a beautiful voice, Marco discovered. Rich and clear, adding depth to every song. After the women were escorted back, Marco stood outside in the cold night, staring at stars. "You've got it bad," Hayes said, appearing with coffee. "I know. She feels it too." Marco's head whipped around. "What?" "My mama sees things, says that girl lights up when you're around, says she's falling for you whether she knows it yet or not." "That makes it worse," Marco said miserably. "Not yet," Hayes corrected. "The war won't last forever." Just hold on. But holding on was becoming harder every day. December arrived with Christmas preparations, and with it came news that would change everything. The announcement came on December 10th. Captain Morrison called an assembly. His face was grave. "Ladies, I've received orders. All Italian prisoners are to be repatriated within 6 weeks. You'll be transported to New York, then ships to Italy." The silence was absolute. 6 weeks. Maria Benedetti raised her hand. "Captain, what if we don't want to go back?" Morrison's expression softened. "The United States is considering allowing certain prisoners to apply for immigration status." Those who can demonstrate self-sufficiency and obtain sponsorship might be permitted to remain. Hope surged through the room like electricity. That evening, the barracks filled with urgent conversations. 28 women wrestling with the most important decision of their lives. Gabriella lay in her cot, thinking about her parents. Her father's restaurant had been destroyed. Her mother was struggling. They needed her, but America had given her something she'd never had. Here, her mixed heritage was less of a burden. Here, Mrs. Hayes mentored her. Here, Hayes treated her like family. Here, she could be herself. And here, there was Marco, who looked at her like she was precious, who made her heart race. She made her decision that night. She would try to stay. The next morning, she approached Marco during his rounds. "Lieutenant De Vincenzo, may I speak with you?" "Of course." He looked around for privacy. "What do you need?" "I want to stay. In America. I need sponsorship. Captain Morrison says possible if I have sponsor. I thought, maybe you know someone." Marco's heart pounded. This was dangerous. But the hope in her eyes made refusing impossible. "Let me see what I can do. I can't promise anything. Thank you. You are very kind to me. Always kind." "Marco," he said suddenly, "when we're alone, call me Marco." Her eyes widened. "Marco is nice name. Gabriella is beautiful." They stood in the snow, looking at each other with awareness of something significant shifting. The careful distance dissolved, replaced by naked longing he couldn't hide. "Gabriella," he said quietly, "when you're no longer a prisoner, when you're free, can I—" He stopped, suddenly aware they were being watched. A guard stood 50 feet away, pretending not to notice, but clearly observing. She understood immediately. "Yes," she whispered, "when I am free. Yes." The promise hung between them like a bridge across an impossible distance. Marco wanted to touch her hand, to pull her close, to close the space that regulations and circumstances kept between them. Instead, he nodded once and stepped back, putting proper distance between officer and prisoner. But as she walked away, Gabriella turned back once, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his breath catch. In that glance, he saw everything she couldn't say aloud. She felt it too. This impossible attraction, this connection that had grown despite every reason it shouldn't. She would wait. They would both wait. And when the war finally released them from these roles, they would see if what burned between them could survive in the daylight of freedom. The days leading up to Christmas passed in a blur of preparation and painful awareness of time slipping away. Gabriella threw herself into cooking, into learning English, into building relationships that might help secure her future in America. But every moment was colored by the knowledge that 6 weeks was not enough time. 6 weeks to transform from enemy prisoner to potential immigrant. 6 weeks to prove she deserved a chance at this new life. 6 weeks to see if what she and Marco felt was real or just the desperate grasping of two lonely people in extraordinary circumstances. Mrs. Hayes became her strongest advocate. She approached Captain Morrison with a proposal. The library needed a permanent assistant, someone bilingual who could help organize the growing collection of Italian language materials, someone intelligent and hard-working, someone like Gabriella. If the captain would write a letter of recommendation supporting her immigration application, Mrs. Hayes would personally sponsor her, providing housing and employment until she could establish herself independently. The offer was more generous than Gabriella could have dreamed. She wept when Mrs. Hayes told her, overwhelmed by the kindness of a woman who owed her nothing, who had every reason to see her as enemy rather than opportunity. "Why?" Gabriella asked through her tears. "Why you help me so much?" Mrs. Hayes smiled, that warm smile that had become so familiar. "Because I see myself in you, child. I know what it means to live between worlds, to never quite fit the categories people want to put you in. And I know that this country, for all its faults, gives people like us a chance to define ourselves on our own terms. You deserve that chance. Sergeant Hayes also stepped forward. He spoke to Marco privately, man to man, setting aside rank for a moment of honest conversation. "I know how you feel about her," Hayes said, "and I know you've been trying to do right by keeping your distance. But Lieutenant, if she stays, if she gets her immigration approved, you should tell her how you feel. Don't let fear or propriety or anything else stop you from taking your shot at happiness." Marco looked at his friend, this wise man who'd become like a brother to him over the months of working together. What if she doesn't feel the same way? What if I've been reading too much into glances and smiles? Hayes laughed, a deep rumbling sound. "Man, everyone on this base can see how that woman looks at you. Everyone except maybe you, because you're too busy trying to be noble about it. Trust me, she feels it. Now you just gotta wait for the right time to do something about it." Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear, the stars bright overhead like distant promises. The camp held a small service in the chapel, and both prisoners and guards were invited to attend. Gabriella sat near the back, Maria Benedetti beside her, listening to carols sung in English and trying to understand the chaplain's sermon about hope and redemption and new beginnings. Marco sat 3 rows ahead, his dark hair gleaming in the candlelight, his strong shoulders squared in his dress uniform. Gabriella couldn't stop looking at the back of his neck, at the place where his hair met his collar, at the way he held himself with quiet confidence. She imagined what it would feel like to touch him, to be held by him, to kiss him without the weight of their circumstances hanging over them. The wanting was a physical ache in her chest, sweet and terrible. After the service, people lingered outside despite the cold, reluctant to end the evening's warmth. Someone started singing "Silent Night," and the familiar melody brought tears to many eyes. Prisoners and guards alike, all of them far from home in one way or another, all of them shaped by a war that seemed to have lasted forever. Marco found himself standing near Gabriella in the crowd, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. He could smell something floral in her hair, could feel the warmth radiating from her body despite the frigid air. His hand hung at his side, and he was acutely aware of her hand hanging at hers, separated by perhaps 6 inches that might as well have been 6 miles. Then, hidden by darkness and the press of bodies around them, Gabriella's hand brushed against his. It could have been accidental, but it wasn't. Marco's breath caught. He stood absolutely still, terrified of breaking this fragile moment. Her pinky finger hooked around his, just that small point of contact, barely anything, everything. They stood that way through 3 more carols, their hands barely touching, their faces carefully neutral, as if nothing momentous was happening between them. When the crowd finally began to disperse and they had to separate, Gabriella whispered so quietly he almost missed it. "Buon Natale, Marco. Merry Christmas." "Buon Natale, Gabriella," Marco whispered back, his voice rough with emotion he could barely contain. Then she was gone, following the other women back to their barracks through the falling snow, and he was left standing in the cold night with the phantom warmth of her finger still burning against his like a brand. Hayes found him there 5 minutes later, still staring at the barracks where Gabriella had disappeared. "You gonna stand out here and freeze to death, or you gonna come inside and tell me what's got you looking like a man who just saw heaven?" Marco turned to his friend, and whatever Hayes saw in his face made him whistle low. "That bad, huh?" "Worse," Marco admitted. "Hayes, I'm in love with her. Completely, impossibly, stupidly in love with her." "I know," Hayes said simply. "Everybody knows except maybe her, and honestly, I think she knows too. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" "Wait," Marco said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Wait until she's no longer a prisoner. Wait until the power dynamic isn't so unbalanced. Wait until I can tell her how I feel without it seeming like coercion." Hayes clapped him on the shoulder. "Then you better hope those immigration applications come through soon, because, Lieutenant, that woman is falling just as hard as you are, and waiting is gonna kill both of you. The new year of 1945 arrived with brutal cold and mounting tension. Immigration applications had been filed for 15 of the 28 Italian women, each one requiring letters of recommendation, proof of employment or sponsorship, character references, and extensive documentation. The bureaucracy moved with glacial slowness, while the deadline for repatriation approached with terrifying speed. The women who had applied for immigration status existed in a strange limbo, not quite prisoners anymore, but not yet free, waiting for decisions that would determine the entire trajectory of their futures. Gabriella's application was among the strongest thanks to Mrs. Hayes. Eleanor Hayes had taken the young woman under her wing with a fierceness that surprised even her own son. She'd gone to Captain Morrison with a formal proposal. The library needed a permanent bilingual assistant, someone who could help organize the growing collection of Italian language materials and help Italian-speaking soldiers with research. Someone intelligent, hard-working, and trustworthy. Someone exactly like Gabriella Russo. If you'll write a letter of recommendation supporting her immigration application, Mrs. Hayes had told the captain with the quiet authority of a woman who'd spent her life fighting for what was right. I will personally sponsor her. I'll provide housing in my home, employment through the library, and supervision until she can establish herself independently. That girl deserves a chance, Captain. And this country needs people like her, people who've seen the worst humanity can offer and still choose kindness. Captain Morrison had agreed, impressed by both Mrs. Hayes's passion and Gabriella's genuine transformation over the months of imprisonment. He'd written a glowing letter of recommendation, as had Lieutenant De Vincenzo, whose carefully professional words somehow managed to convey deep admiration without crossing any inappropriate lines. Sergeant Hayes had contributed his own testimonial, describing Gabriella's contributions to the kitchen and her positive influence on camp morale. Even several of the other guards had written brief notes supporting her character. But strong applications didn't guarantee approval, and as January stretched into February with no word from the immigration authorities, anxiety became a constant companion for all 15 women who'd applied to stay. They moved through their daily routines with forced normalcy, working in the kitchen and library and administrative offices, attending English lessons that Mrs. Hayes had organized, participating in evening gatherings where prisoners and guards now mingled with easy familiarity. But underneath every smile, every conversation, every moment of laughter ran an undercurrent of desperate hope and fear. Gabriella found herself increasingly unable to sleep. She'd lie in her cot at night, listening to the other women breathing around her, and wonder what she would do if her application was denied. Return to Italy, to the ruins and chaos in a country that had never fully accepted her mixed heritage. Try to find her parents in the devastation, assuming they'd survived. The thought filled her with dread so profound it made her chest tight. But even worse was the thought of leaving Marco. They'd barely touched, barely spoken beyond polite exchanges in the presence of others, yet somehow he'd become the center of her world. She found herself watching for him constantly, her heart rate increasing whenever he entered a room, her entire body attuned to his presence like a compass pointing north. The way he looked at her when he thought no one was watching, with a hunger and tenderness that made her breath catch. The careful distance he maintained, respecting her even when she desperately wished he wouldn't. The sound of his voice speaking Italian, wrapping around her like a caress. She was in love with him, deeply, terrifyingly, completely in love with an American officer who couldn't act on his feelings while she remained a prisoner. And the cruelty of that timing, of finally finding someone who saw all of her and loved what he saw, only to face the very real possibility of being torn apart by bureaucracy or circumstance, was almost unbearable. Marco was suffering his own private hell. Every day he had to watch Gabriella move through the camp, had to maintain professional distance when every instinct screamed at him to pull her close and never let go. He saw the worry in her eyes, the way she'd touch the small cross she wore around her neck when she was anxious, the forced brightness of her smile when she was trying to hide her fear. He wanted to promise her everything would work out, that her application would be approved, that they'd have their chance. But he couldn't make promises he had no power to keep. Hayes watched them both, circling each other like binary stars, caught in each other's gravity, and his heart ached for them. He'd seen a lot in his years in the army, but he'd never seen two people so obviously meant for each other, being kept apart by circumstances beyond their control. He did what he could, creating opportunities for them to work together in the kitchen, assigning them to the same work details when possible, giving them moments of proximity, even if he couldn't give them privacy. The women who had decided to return to Italy began preparing for departure. Tearful goodbyes were exchanged in advance, no one knowing if they'd ever see each other again. Maria Benedetti was among those returning, drawn back by loyalty to her husband, who was somewhere in Italy, assuming he'd survived the war's final bloody months. She'd become close to Gabriella over their months of imprisonment, and their final conversation carried the weight of everything they'd been through together. "You should know," Maria said carefully as they sat together in the barracks on a cold February evening, "before I go, that you've changed my mind about many things, about what I was taught, about what I believed." Gabriella looked at her with surprise and wariness. "What do you mean?" Maria's voice was thick with shame. "In Italy, I believed the propaganda about Africans, about colonial subjects, about the natural hierarchy of peoples. I was polite to you, Gabriella, but I didn't really see you as my equal. I didn't question what we were taught about race and superiority." She paused, tears forming. "I'm so ashamed of that now." "Maria," Gabriella began, but the other woman shook her head. "Let me finish. Watching you here, seeing how the Americans treat you with genuine respect, seeing your dignity and intelligence and kindness shine through once you felt safe enough to show it, it made me realize how poisoned we all were by fascist ideology. You were never less than me. I was just too blind and too indoctrinated to see it." Maria reached out and took Gabriella's hand. "Thank you for showing me what I was too ignorant to understand before. Thank you for being patient with me while I learned to see clearly." They embraced, two women from opposite sides of multiple divides, united by shared experience and the hard-won wisdom that came from having everything you thought you knew proven wrong. When they pulled apart, both had tears streaming down their faces. "Promise me something," Maria said. "Promise me you'll be happy here, that you'll build a beautiful life, that you'll show this country what an extraordinary woman you are. And promise me," she added with a knowing smile, "that you'll let that handsome lieutenant love you the way he so obviously wants to." Gabriella felt her face heat. "Is it that obvious?" "To everyone except maybe you," Maria laughed. "That man looks at you like you hung the moon and stars, and you look at him the same way. Don't waste time being cautious once you're free, Gabriella. We've all learned that life is too short and too uncertain. Take your happiness while you can." The trucks came at dawn on February 28th to transport the first group to the port in New York. 13 women boarded with their small bags of belongings, heading back across the Atlantic to a Germany they barely recognized from the reports. Gabriella stood with the other women who were staying, watching friends depart, wondering if they'd made the right choice or if they were being cowards for not returning to help rebuild their shattered homeland. But as the trucks pulled away and she turned back to face the camp that had become her temporary home, Gabriella felt certainty settle in her bones despite her anxiety about the pending immigration decision. This was where she was meant to be, here in this strange country that had room for her complexity, here where she could cook food that blended all parts of her heritage, here where Mrs. Hayes mentored her like a daughter, here where Hayes treated her like family, here where Marco was. The immigration approvals came on March 15th, arriving in a single batch that caused jubilation and heartbreak in equal measure. 10 applications approved, 5 denied. Gabriella stood in Captain Morrison's office at 10:00 hours, hands shaking as she held the official document granting her permission to remain in the United States under Mrs. Hayes's sponsorship with a pathway to eventual citizenship. "Congratulations, Miss Russo," Captain Morrison said with genuine warmth. "You've earned this opportunity. Make the most of it." She walked out of his office in a daze, the precious papers clutched in her hands like they might disappear if she loosened her grip. She was no longer a prisoner. She was a sponsored immigrant with legal status and the right to remain in America and build a life here. She was free. The realization hit her all at once, and she had to lean against the building's exterior wall before her legs gave out entirely. That's where Marco found her 10 minutes later, sitting on the cold ground with tears streaming down her face and the most radiant smile he'd ever seen lighting up her features. "Gabriella," he approached carefully, his heart pounding. "What happened?" "Did your application approvato," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "It's approved. Marco, I can stay. I can stay in America." The joy that flooded through Marco was so intense, it was almost painful. Without thinking, without caring who might see, he reached down and pulled her to her feet, and then into his arms. She came willingly, pressing against him, her face buried in his chest, her hands fisting in his uniform jacket. He held her like she was the most precious thing in the world, because to him she was. "You can stay," he repeated, his voice rough with emotion. "Gabriella, you can stay." They stood that way for a long moment, holding each other in the weak March sunlight, neither caring about protocol or propriety anymore. She was no longer his prisoner. He was no longer her guard. The barriers that had kept them apart for months had finally fallen, and nothing was stopping them anymore. When they finally pulled apart, Marco kept his hands on her shoulders, looking down at her with an expression that made her heart race. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Something I've wanted to say for months, but couldn't." "Tell me," she whispered, her dark eyes shining. "I love you, Gabriella. I fell in love with you the moment you stepped off that truck back in October. And every single day since has only made it stronger. I don't care that it's complicated or unusual or that people will talk. I love you, and if you'll have me, I want to build a life with you. I want everything with you." Gabriella felt like her heart might burst from her chest with the force of her happiness. "I love you too, Marco. I have loved you for so long I thought I would die from keeping it secret." He kissed her then, finally, properly, his lips meeting hers with a gentleness that quickly deepened into passion months in the making. She melted into him, her hands sliding up to tangle in his hair, her body pressed against his, and everything else fell away except this. Them. Finally, free to be together. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Marco rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I know it's fast. I know we should probably wait. But Gabriella, I don't want to wait anymore. I've waited long enough. Marry me." "Yes," she said without hesitation, without doubt. "Yes, Marco. Yes to everything." They were married on April 28th, 1945, in a small ceremony at the base chapel. Mrs. Hayes stood as Gabriella's sponsor and surrogate mother, her eyes wet with happy tears as she watched the young woman she'd come to love like a daughter pledge her life to the Italian-American lieutenant who'd fallen so completely for her. Sergeant Hayes served as Marco's best man, his broad smile reflecting his deep satisfaction at seeing two people he cared about finally getting their happiness. Captain Morrison officiated, having secured special permission to perform the ceremony. Corporal Morrison sang Ave Maria in Italian, her voice soaring through the small chapel and bringing tears to many eyes. The other women who'd been approved for immigration status attended, along with guards who'd become friends over the months of working together. Even some of the civilian staff came, drawn by the love story that had captivated the entire camp. Gabriella wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Hayes had altered from her own wedding gown, the fabric falling gracefully over her slender frame. She carried a small bouquet of early spring flowers that Hayes had somehow procured despite the season. Marco wore his dress uniform, his dark hair slicked back, his eyes never leaving his bride's face as she walked down the short aisle toward him. When Captain Morrison asked if anyone objected to the union, the chapel remained silent, except for a few emotional sniffles. When he pronounced them husband and wife and told Marco he could kiss his bride, the kiss they shared was tender and sweet and full of promise for all the days to come. The reception was held in the mess hall, transformed by decorations and filled with food that represented both their heritages. Hayes had outdone himself, preparing a feast that blended Italian and American and even Eritrean dishes, honoring every part of Gabriella's identity. There was pasta alla norma and fried chicken, arancini and collard greens, injera with spicy wat that Gabriella had taught Hayes to make from her father's recipes, and sweet potato pie alongside tiramisu. People ate and danced and celebrated two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd fallen in love despite every reason they shouldn't, who represented the possibility of healing and new beginnings in a world that desperately needed both. When Marco took Gabriella in his arms for their first dance as husband and wife, everyone in the room felt the power of what they were witnessing. Not just a wedding, but a testament to the resilience of the human heart, to love's ability to transcend boundaries of nation and race and circumstance. As they swayed together to music played on Hayes's borrowed phonograph, Marco whispered in Italian, "Are you happy, mia moglie?" "My wife." "Happier than I ever dreamed possible, mio marito," Gabriella whispered back. "My husband, you've given me everything, Marco. A home, a family, a future. You've given me myself." The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, just 10 days after their wedding. Victory in Europe Day brought celebrations across America and relief that the fighting on one front, at least, was finally over. At Camp Kilmer, the mood was jubilant but complicated, joy for peace mixed with awareness that the Pacific War continued and that the work of rebuilding a shattered world was only beginning. For Marco and Gabriella, now living in a small apartment in town, thanks to his officer's housing allowance, the end of the war meant new possibilities. Marco would be discharged within months as the military began drawing down its forces. They could build the life they'd dreamed of, free from the constraints of military service and wartime regulations. Gabriella continued working in the base library under Mrs. Hayes's supervision, her English improving daily, her confidence growing as she realized this country truly did have room for someone like her. She was no longer the frightened prisoner who'd stepped off that truck in October, no longer the woman caught between worlds with no place to call home. She was Gabriella De Vincenzo, wife of Marco, daughter figure to Eleanor Hayes, friend to William Hayes, immigrant to America, and she was finally fully herself. In June, Marco received his discharge papers. He'd been offered a position with his uncle's construction company in the Bronx, helping to build housing for returning veterans. It was honest work, good work, and it would allow them to settle in New York's Italian-American community, where Gabriella's mixed heritage would be less unusual than it might be elsewhere. They said goodbye to Camp Kilmer on a warm June morning, their few possessions packed in 2 suitcases. Hayes and his mother came to see them off, embraces shared all around, promises made to stay in touch and visit often. "You take care of each other," Hayes told them, his voice gruff with emotion. "And Gabriella, you make sure this knucklehead appreciates what he's got." "Every single day," Gabriella promised, squeezing Hayes's hands. "Thank you, William, for everything, for seeing me as human when you had every reason not to, for teaching me to cook again, for being family when I had none." Mrs. Hayes pulled Gabriella into a fierce embrace. "You write to me, you hear? And you come visit. You'll always have a home with us." The train to New York departed at noon, carrying Marco and Gabriella toward their new life together. As the landscape rolled past the window, Gabriella leaned against her husband's shoulder, his arm around her, and marveled at how far she'd traveled in 9 months. From enemy prisoner to free woman, from someone defined by circumstances beyond her control to someone who could choose her own destiny, from loneliness to love so complete, it still sometimes took her breath away. Marco pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "What are you thinking about, amore mio?" "Everything," she said softly. "How afraid I was when I first arrived. How certain I was that Americans would hate me for being enemy, for being black, for being different. How wrong I was." "Not wrong about everything," Marco corrected gently. "This country has its problems. You'll face prejudice, Gabriella, people who don't understand, who judge based on your skin color or your accent. It won't always be easy." "I know," she said, "but I'd rather face those challenges with you, building something new, than return to a place where I never fully belonged. Here I can be all of myself, Italian and Eritrean and American. Your wife, Eleanor's adopted daughter, a cook who blends traditions, a woman who survived war and found love on the other side." They settled in the Bronx in a small apartment above a bakery, the smell of fresh bread reminding Gabriella powerfully of her father. Marco started work with his uncle's construction company while Gabriella found employment at a local library, her bilingual skills making her valuable to the immigrant community. In the evenings, she cooked, blending the techniques Hayes had taught her with her father's Sicilian recipes and her own Eritrean heritage, creating fusion dishes that couldn't exist anywhere else. Word spread about her cooking, and soon neighbors were stopping by, asking if she'd cater events or teach them her recipes. Within a year, Marco and Gabriella had saved enough to open their own small restaurant, a modest storefront in the Bronx that they called Due Mondi, 2 worlds. The menu featured dishes from both their heritages, Italian classics alongside Eritrean specialties, all prepared with the skill and love Gabriella had learned from her father. The restaurant became a gathering place for the neighborhood, a space where Italian immigrants and African-American families and returning veterans all felt welcome, where different cultures met over shared meals, where the De Vincenzo's love story inspired others to look past surface differences and see the humanity underneath. Hayes and his mother came to the grand opening in July of 1946, traveling from New Jersey to celebrate their friend's success. Hayes surveyed the bustling restaurant with satisfaction, watching Gabriella move through the dining room with confidence and grace, her hand occasionally brushing Marco's as they worked side by side. "You did good, Lieutenant," he told Marco. "Real good." "I got lucky," Marco corrected. "Luckiest man alive." Their first child, a daughter they named Eleanor Maria after the 2 women who'd helped make their happiness possible, was born in March of 1947. She had her mother's dark skin and her father's Italian features, beautiful and unique, a perfect blend of both their heritages. When Gabriella held her daughter for the first time, she wept with joy and gratitude for this life she'd built, this family she'd created, this happiness she'd found in the most unlikely place. Marco stood beside her hospital bed, looking down at his wife and daughter with wonder. "She's perfect," he whispered. "You're both perfect." "We're blessed," Gabriella corrected softly. "So incredibly blessed." 2 more children followed, a son named William after Hayes, born in 1949, and another daughter, Sophia, born in 1951. The De Vincenzo children grew up bilingual, speaking Italian and English with equal fluency, learning about their Italian and Eritrean heritage with equal pride, growing up in a home filled with love and good food, and the constant reminder that their parents' love had transcended war and prejudice and every obstacle that had tried to keep them apart. The restaurant thrived, expanding into the adjacent storefront in 1955, hiring staff to help manage the growing demand. Gabriella's reputation as a chef grew, her fusion cooking becoming celebrated in food magazines and newspapers. But she never forgot where she'd learned her craft, the kindness of a Negro sergeant who'd seen past enemy and prisoner to recognize a fellow cook, the mentorship of a woman who'd believed in her potential, the love of a man who'd waited for her freedom to declare his heart. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1955, Marco and Gabriella returned to Camp Kilmer, now mostly decommissioned as the military downsized in the post-war years. They stood together where they'd first met, where she'd stepped off that truck and their eyes had first locked, where an impossible love story had begun, against all odds. "Do you ever regret it?" Marco asked, his arm around her waist. "Staying here instead of returning to Italy?" Gabriella leaned into him, her head on his shoulder. "Not for one single moment. Everything I needed was here. You, our family, our life, the freedom to be myself. Italy was where I came from, but America is where I became who I was meant to be." "And who is that?" Marco asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Yours," she said simply, "and my own. Finally, completely my own." 20 years later, in 1965, Gabriella stood in the kitchen of Due Mondi, now a thriving restaurant with a second location in Manhattan, watching her daughter Eleanor work the line with the same passion and skill she'd passed down. Her children had all inherited her love of cooking, but Eleanor had it the strongest, that instinctive understanding of flavor and technique that couldn't be taught, only born. Marco came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. At 50, he was graying at the temples, but still strong, still vital, still looking at her with the same love and desire he'd had at 29. "What are you thinking about, amore?" "Everything," Gabriella said, the same answer she'd given him on that train 20 years earlier. "How afraid I was when I arrived in America. How impossible everything seemed. How miraculously it all worked out." "Not miraculous," Marco corrected. "You worked for this. You built this. You took the chance you were given and created something beautiful." "We created something beautiful," Gabriella amended, turning in his arms to face him. "Together." He kissed her, soft and sweet, a kiss that still made her heart race after 20 years of marriage. "Together," he agreed. "Always together." That evening they hosted a special dinner at the restaurant, a reunion of sorts. Hayes and his mother came, now elderly but still sharp and engaged. Several of the women who'd been imprisoned with Gabriella attended, those who'd stayed in America and built their own lives. Even Captain Morrison, long retired, made the journey. They sat around a long table laden with food that represented all their journeys. Italian dishes and American Southern cooking and Eritrean specialties, all prepared with love and skill, all testament to how far they'd come from that cold October day in 1944, when 28 frightened women had stepped off trucks into an uncertain future. Hayes raised his glass, his voice still strong despite his years. "To second chances, to the courage to choose happiness, to the power of kindness to change lives, and to Gabriella and Marco, who proved that love can transcend anything if you're brave enough to fight for it." "Salute!" they all echoed, glasses clinking together, different languages and backgrounds united by shared history and genuine affection. As the evening wore on, filled with laughter and stories and good food, Gabriella looked around at the faces of people who'd become her family, not bound by blood, but by experience, by choice, by love. This was what she'd been given when she'd been granted permission to stay in America. Not just freedom, but family. Not just survival, but the chance to thrive. Not just existence, but a life rich with meaning and connection and love. Marco squeezed her hand under the table and she squeezed back, that simple gesture containing everything they'd been through together, everything they'd built, everything they still had to look forward to. She'd arrived in America as a prisoner, an enemy, someone the world said shouldn't exist in the spaces between categories. But she'd found a place where all of her could not just exist, but flourish, where her mixed heritage was celebrated rather than questioned, where her skills were valued, where she was loved completely for all that she was. And that, Gabriella thought, as she looked around at her family, both born and chosen, was the true American promise. Not that life would be easy, but that it would be possible. That you could arrive as one thing and become something else entirely. That you could write your own story rather than being confined to the one others wrote for you. That love could transcend every boundary humans tried to build between each other. She had arrived as Gabriella Russo, prisoner of war. She had become Gabriella De Vincenzo, chef, wife, mother, immigrant, American. And in between those two names lived a love story that proved against all odds that hope and kindness and human connection could triumph over even the darkest circumstances war could create. Marco leaned over and whispered in her ear, "Buon Natale, mia bella." Using their private code from that first Christmas Eve, the moment everything had changed. "Buon Natale, my love," she whispered back, her heart full to bursting. "Every day with you is Christmas." And it was true. Every morning she woke up beside him, every meal they shared, every challenge they faced together, every joy they celebrated. It was all a gift she'd never expected to receive, a gift born from the generosity of strangers who'd chosen to see her humanity when they could have seen only an enemy, a gift nurtured by a love that had waited patiently for the right moment to bloom. A gift that had transformed a frightened prisoner into a woman who knew exactly who she was and where she belonged.